Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. Today, I want to talk about the core audience of comics and how comics needs a core audience in order to survive. And I think this is a really important topic and one that people have not talked about nor thought really about for a long time. I would say maybe even back to the early 1990s. But the comic industry, like any good industry, needs a core. It needs something that will sustain it, or else it's going to die. And I think that's what's happening to comics now, and has been happening to comics for a while now, that it's been getting so niche that it's ignoring the fact that it needs a core even. And the analogy that I like to think about is it's like a tree. You know, a tree starts, a big tree, like a big giant maple tree. It starts to die by rotting from the inside out. The inside rots away first. And when it starts to rot away on the inside, it starts to get all these little offshoots and suckers coming out of the bottom. And then some storm comes along and just snaps it in half. And then it's dead. That's what happens to a tree. And that's what happens to industries as well. If you don't have a core, if that core has been rotted out, it's ready to fall. You get all these offshoots coming out of it because it still has roots that are still drawing life out of the earth. But the tree itself, it's just going to die. And that's what comics has become. A lot of industries, I think, have become this. I think the whole entertainment industry, both for movies and for television especially, have become this as well. They have lost their core, and they're just going to die. Now, who is the core, or who should be? And I know that's a odd way, I'm sure some people might think of putting it. Who should be the core audience? And when I say should be, I mean, who are the core audience that keep industries alive? Not just the comic industry, but any other industry, although I'm going to focus on the comic industry. What is the core that was going to keep it alive? Well, we'll look at historically what was the core that kept it alive. And that's what we should have, or at the very least go back to and see what happens. And the core, I like to think of it as being the PG-13. That was your core comic. It was your PG-13. Because I started to think about this a lot when I was thinking about the different genres of comic. Because there's a whole lot of different genres of comic that work. And I want to do a video sometime about all these different genres and how they might be able to work again. But you have a lot of different genres. You got your cartoonish genre, when you have things like Daffy Duck or Woody Woodpecker or Scrooge McDuck, things like that when I grew up anyways. Those were cartoonish comics. You had cartoonish comics. You also had war comics. You also had things like jungle comics, whereas the cartoonish ones would appeal downwards to kids. Things like war comics or horror comics, they would appeal upwards to adults more. And you had Westerns, you had romance comics, and I think romance comics are making a big comeback because of manga. But you had a lot of different kinds of genres. But I think that the core genre of all of these for comics is indeed superhero comics. Why? Because whereas the cartoonish ones appeal down to children, and the horror and the war ones appeal upwards to adults, the superhero comic can be that PG-13 kind of core, because it can appeal upwards and it can appeal downwards and it can appeal to the middle. And again, to bring it back to like a PG-13 film, how does it work? How does a good one work before you even have a script or anything else? Well, it works if the parent says to the kid, hey, let's go see this movie, and the kid isn't bored when they go see the movie. And at the same time, if you have the kid say to the parent, hey, let's go see this movie, and they go see the movie, the parent isn't bored. And at the same time as well, you have teenage kids who are saying to each other, hey, let's go see this movie together. And you're not embarrassed by going to see it as a teenager. You don't feel like a little kid. You don't get roasted by your friends for suggesting, let's go see this movie. That happened to me a lot when I was a kid. I don't know about girls, but as a teenage boy, yeah, we all went out to see movies. It was guys and girls, friends, and I would get roasted severely by some of the things that I would pick. I think that was just part of growing up. I still hope that it's part of growing up. I don't know if it is or not, but, that's one of the things that at the very least teenage boys did. You roast your friends for doing things that are childish. You roast your friends for a lot of different things, but that's one of the things you roast them for. So, PG-13, it appeals both downwards, upwards, and to the middle. And it may seem a little bit bland to people who are used to niche, this or that, especially niche adult things, but you got to have a central core that appeals to the most people possible, because that's going to bring in the money and that's going to be sustainable. And that's why sort of PG-13 works. But comics stopped being PG-13. Again, I would say it started in the early 90s, but sort of really hit in the late 90s. And there's a lot of different ways in which this happened. And because there's a lot of different ways, and there's a lot of different reasons why I gave up on comics. I used the term rage quit before. We didn't have the term rage quit back in the late 90s. Really, I quit out of disgust more than anything else. And a couple of those ways were because comics were becoming too niche in certain ways. One of the bigger examples was because characters are becoming hypersexualized. Because that's going to appeal to your adult audience. But it's not going to appeal, and it might even appeal to your teenage audience, but it's not going to appeal downwards to your children. And adults, parents, are going to feel uncomfortable by giving those things to their children if people are hypersexualized in their comics. And that's one of the things that happened in the late 90s. I was always a big Fantastic Four fan. Well, that was one of the things I had bought from the very first that really nobody else bought, or a lot of people that I knew anyways. But I never stopped buying Fantastic Four. And when they tried to reboot it in the late 90s, it became hypersexualized. It's one of the reasons why I dropped comics, was because of what they did to Fantastic Four. Okay? Because when you have a story, because we're going for superhero comics here. So superhero comics are your core because they can appeal up and down and to the middle. So you have your superhero comics. And if you're appealing up and down to the middle and to the middle, what you're focusing on is the action adventure. That's what you're focusing on. But these people in the late 90s, they took Sue Storm, which I'm using as my example, and they hypersexualized her by, I think it was Jim Lee that tried to do the reboot, by putting her in positions which would take your mind and drive it in a completely different direction than action adventure. And I'm pretty sure you know what I'm talking about. And that's what they did. And I got no problem with women in comics. I got no problem with women that are acting like women. I got no problem with women that are even alluring, because it is a visual medium. But there's a line that you cross when you hypersexualize something. There's a line there. And I think the line is that it takes you out of the story and drives your mind into that other direction. Because the main part of the story is action adventure. And then when they started doing that, they're driving comics into a niche market, more adult, and excluding children. And one of those other reasons why was because comics started to become preachy, really preachy. And that's one of the main core things, because I'll use another example as well, because I was a big Star Trek fan when I was a kid, watching the original series. And I knew that there were some episodes that were kind of preachy. I tried to ignore them. But then the Next Generation came along, and I really wanted to watch it, but it was kind of preachy. And again, I get roasted by my friends going, really? You watching that? You're listening to what they're saying, right? You know, they would roast me. I remember watching it with one of my friends, and him rolling his eyes because some of the guys on the Enterprise were wearing, what in the original Star Trek would look like a female dress uniform. It would be a dress. And he would just roll his eyes and go, seriously? You're watching that? He would just roast me. And then, Voyager came along and Deep Space Nine, and just kept on getting worse. And by the time that Enterprise came along, I couldn't get through the first season. I just couldn't. I had to drop it because I knew it was preachy. It was just, it was way too preachy. I said to myself, okay, listen, if I want a sermon, I'll go to church. I don't need it in my story. I don't need it in my action adventure. This is my action adventure story that I love. You're taking me out of the story and shoving these other things into my face. Goodbye. And I was saying that as a really big Star Trek fan. And the same thing happened with comics. The same thing happened. They started becoming preachy. And there's a reason why they started becoming preachy. And again, what does it come back to? It comes back to SJWs. Again, didn't call them that back then. I guess there'd be proto-SJWs back then. But that's what it was. Because when you have that line that I'm always talking about, the last 10 minutes, you have that line which you don't cross. What is that line? Who sets that line? Where does it come from? Well, that line should be what we used to call manners and etiquette. What I would call, for the purpose of this video, it's good taste. Good taste sets that line. And good taste is an organic thing. Manners and etiquette to some degree are an organic thing. Again, we'll go back to what I was talking about before. It's where if you're a child and you have your parent sitting next to you, you don't feel uncomfortable. And if you're a parent and you have your child sitting next to you, you don't feel uncomfortable. It's an organic thing. We all know what would make us feel uncomfortable as a kid sitting next to a parent. What kind of things flashing over the screen would make you uncomfortable, and vice versa for the parent and the child. So it's an organic thing, and it comes out of society, and it can change, and it can move from one side to the other at times. But it comes from your salt of the earth kind of people being comfortable with what's going on. And that's your good taste. But in the early 90s, and certainly in the later 90s, people started to replace good taste with political correctness. And I think you know what kind of people they were. And that's when the core started to die. Because they replaced good taste with political correctness. And of course, political correctness is way over here on the left. So they're saying, this line is way over here on the left, whereas your organic line for good taste, which just comes about through normal interaction of society, your salt of the earth people, it just comes about from everyday living. And they're thinking to themselves, no, the line's over here. This is where the line is over there. It's not way over there to the left. So the people producing the product and the people consuming the product have different ideas of what the core is and where this line that you don't cross is. And that's when the core dies. Because the people producing the product are not producing the product for the customers, not for the base customers. And if they are producing it for customers, those customers do not make up the majority of the people who want to buy the product. And therefore, when you don't have a majority of people that want to buy it, you're a niche market. And your niche market is just suckers coming out of the bottom of the tree. Something that's going to die. That's what political correctness does. And it does it for a lot of different kinds of industries. Because again, your good manners, your good taste, it comes about organically. Whereas political correctness is right in the term there. Where does it come about from? Well, it's a form of a political ideology. It's not something that is just there for you as a human being and interacting with other human beings and a society. It's this other layer that has been slapped on top of things according to a certain political ideology. That's what political correctness is. And that's what more and more they're trying to replace manners and good taste with political correctness. And to bring it back to comics again, that's why the industry is dying. So our comic industry needs to go back to that core. And that core, again, who sets it? Well, we should let economics set it. We should say, this is the majority of people who want to read these comics. This is how the industry makes a lot of money, by appealing to the most people possible. We should listen to that. We should not tell them what they want to read. We should allow the organic line of just good taste to economically show us what they want and where our comics should be. And yes, you can still have some niche genres like horror, but they can't be the core. And this is really, it's still missing there, because I was really excited about alternate comics when it came out. And, it's good old newsprint, not very expensive comics, just your good old comics. But when I saw their line, I was a bit disappointed because, again, it's still niche. There's still a lot of horror in there, mostly horror, I would say, but it's just niche in one form or another. And if we want a good, healthy industry, we need the core back. And again, you're not all going to get exactly what you want because you're having some consideration for the other person as well. But again, that consideration is the same consideration that would come about if you're standing next to your parent as a child, or you're standing next to your kid as a parent, and both of you are okay with this. Or you're standing next to your buddy as a teenager, and both of you are saying, hey, that's cool. It's really not that hard. I don't know why people don't get this, who, do people from the entertainment industry. Why do they not get this? I don't understand why. Anyway, that was my little rant for today. There's a lot of threads in that I want to pull on later. A lot of different videos I want to talk about. But hopefully I gave you something new to think about. Hopefully, once in a while, maybe eventually, someone who actually produces comics might actually listen to this. And, we might get this idea out there that, yes, we do need a core industry so that we can make comics better, so that we can have a thriving, healthy industry like it used to be. All right. So hopefully I gave you something new to think about. That's what I'm here for. I'm sharing my ideas. Hopefully you can share my ideas with other people as well. Share the link for this video. Hit like, hit subscribe. That's great. It helps my videos a lot, especially when you share it. And leave comments. Give me something new to think about too. Thanks a lot for being here for a whole 17 minutes. I'll see you later. Bye.